Okay, everyone, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. We are so excited you're joining us for the webinar going over some of the insights from our 2025 diversity report. And what we've named this is what 23 million applications reveal about fair hiring in government. And we're going to walk through some of the key findings, and we're going to talk about some concrete steps that you can look at doing to help make more data-informed hiring processes and see and benchmark yourself against what's happening nationally. Happy 25 years. This is our 25th year at NEOGOV. Oh my gosh. Okay. Here we go. Okay. I'm Julianne Gray. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager at NEOGOV, and I work on things like user behavior, hiring trends, and how agencies like yours use data to improve their hiring processes. And I'm also joined by our Chief Human Resources Officer, Reed Walsh. Reed joins us with extensive public sector HR leadership experience, and she's going to use her real-world experience to translate some of these findings into actionable things that you can take in your organization. To get started, we wanted to make this a little more interactive. So if you could go ahead and get out your phone, scan the QR code, and we're going to ask some poll questions as we go along. And I'll give you another second or two to get that scanned, and then we'll do a quick test to make sure everything's working. Okay, so our first question, this is our test question. Where are you joining us from? So you can put city, state, etc. And as you guys enter them, they should just start popping up live. Okay. You can see that several people are typing, so there we go. So California, Kentucky, Oregon, Utah, Atlanta, Anaheim. Looks like we've got a great representation across the country, and hopefully you can see that that there's a lot of other people that are interested in this same topic throughout in your sister organizations around the country. So the first question that we wanted to start out with is kind of a high-level question, and that is, what story does your data tell about your hiring process? And I want you to think about that as we are digging into this report and talking about some of these insights, to think about, does your data reflect what is actually happening, or does it reveal any trends that you may not have anticipated, and how does that stack up against what's happening nationally based on the data that comes out of this report? And so hopefully today, these insights will help illuminate where some of those key points are and where you can focus your efforts in improving your hiring funnel. So before we dig in, I wanted to highlight, this is our 2025 diversity report, Building Inclusive Public Sector Workforces. We will send this out with the slides and the recording from this webinar probably tomorrow. And we've got a lot more insights besides just the few that we're going to talk about today. But I hope you guys will take a look at that and use that as to kick off some conversations within your organization. So, okay, let's start to get in here. So the first place we wanted to start is just briefly give you a sense of where this data came from. So we looked at the data in our Insight product, 23.3 million public sector job applications that came in between January 2022 to June 2025. And then in some of the slides and metrics that we've looked at, we benchmarked that against what's happening against census data, against what's happening population-wide broadly. And so those are the two key sources of the data. I know that could be important to know where is this information coming from. The second piece is I wanted to make sure we are all on the same page with how we're defining some of the things we're going to talk about. So there are 4 key stages we're going to talk about not only today, but also in the report, the full report. And that is applied, qualified, referred, and hired. And the way we define each of those is applied is pretty obvious. Someone applied and they submitted an application. The second piece is qualified, applicants who meet the minimum job qualifications for the position that they are applying for. The third is referred, which is candidates that are passed on from HR to the hiring manager to do that next level evaluation specifically for the position. And finally, hired, pretty obvious. It's people who've received an offer and accepted it. Like I said, we wanted to make sure before we dig into the specifics that we're all on the same page with those. So we're going to do another quick poll question, and that is how many steps are in your current hiring process that are measured with data today? And we have a few choices, all, some, only a few, or all. Awesome. Looks like, again, we kind of are across the board. Some of you are looking at that data across the board, and several of you are just starting out on this journey of figuring out where to dig into the data a little bit more. But hopefully that helps you see that, again, everybody's across the map as far as where they're at in starting to take a data-informed approach to hiring. Okay, and at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Reed to talk about some of the key insights from the report.
Julian, thank you. It's good to be here with everybody. It's kind of a weird experience from our end because I'm really just looking at this and I can't feel the feels from you guys. Maybe some of you on the phone were able to join us at Ignite, which was our user conference. I highly encourage you to do that or become a user and then come to the user conference if you're not a NEOGOV user yet. It was a really great session, and we went over, the report wasn't published yet, but we did have an opportunity to go over some of the key insights from the report. And I think this is going to be a continuation of that, and now everyone will definitively have the report in its hands. Let me back up by saying, Julianne mentioned my extensive government experience, which is nice and generous, but I did get to spend 8 years as the head of HR for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So all of you, all of our customers, one thing to keep in mind is, you contribute to this data. So when we say, the amount of data that we can mine to get these insights, it's because we have such an amazing amount of customers and a diversity of customers. So when I think about my Commonwealth experience, we had 72,000 employees. We were civil service for 70% of our positions, and we had 21 unions. So my experience trying to drive things like diversity initiatives may be a little bit different than some of you on the phone. But the universal key here is that we all have data, and we can all get insights for looking at that data, trying to diagnose problems, where are they along our data journey, and and how do we attack the problems that we think will have the most impact. So it goes obviously beyond diversity initiatives, but that's what we're going to talk about in particular today. So great to be here. And please feel free to chime in on the chat. Julianne's going to monitor that, and we can hopefully answer questions as we go along. So the 5 key insights from the report. So one thing is public sector work continues to attract a more diverse applicant pool. We can see this because we look at our Bureau of Labor statistics. Generally, public sector is a place that's seen as the doors are open to a reflection of our populations. We do also know that Black candidates are well represented in applications, but continue to face barriers later in the hiring process. So when you look at that funnel that we are talking about, from applied to qualified to referred, that's where we start to see some of that trail off efforts, and we're going to get into that a little bit more in depth. Diversity can vary significantly across job categories. You may see that in your environment as well, and some of the stuff may look very familiar to you. You go, oh, yep, that's us. Or I have the same type of problem, but maybe it looks a little bit different. Hispanic and Latino representation has been rising. It tends to be clustered in a few fields. So just to give you some insight into what's happening with the Hispanic and Latino population. And then as salaries increase, we are seeing those representation gaps widen. So we'll break down each one of these a little bit more. All right, so public sector draws more diverse applicants. I want to caveat this with saying that I've been through all iterations of hiring. Sometimes you're like, I just want one person to apply. I don't even have the ability right now to think about things that enrich our environments like diversity. So just know that, we also realize that there are struggles, especially for those, the fourth quartile, those jobs, oh, we got a ton here, but down in this lower quartile, we really don't have anybody. So maybe this isn't super relevant to this. What I heard from some of you when we were at our session at Ignite is diversity is actually not my problem in certain areas. It's diversity in other ways. I really need people who can speak Spanish or speak other languages. So there's lots of ways to look at this, but this is what the data is telling us right now. We know that the public sector roles appeal strongly to traditionally underrepresented populations in our overall workforce. This tells us that people feel like we are a place with open doors. The mission alignment seems to appeal to a lot of people across a lot of different areas. So if you look at this chart right now, you can see the blue line is representing the US workforce, and the public sector workforce is representing what's going on in the applications of our employees. So Julian, keep me honest on this. So when we look at this, we're looking strictly at applicants. Here's what it looks like for US workforce, about 59% white applications, about 41% in the public sector. When you go down to people who identified as Black, there was a 14% representation in the workforce overall, 26% in the public sector in terms of applications, and then so on. So Hispanic, Latino our workforce is 19%, 20% of applicants, and so on and so on. So this gives you a really good feel for, why we appeal to a lot of people. I encourage you to continue to look at these things that we know move the needle for applicants. In public sector, these things are mission. People really do stand behind mission. They also want to be where they can have competitive benefits. I know we hear things like the pension is leaving, the benefits, aren't quite what they used to be maybe 25, 30 years ago, but relative to what's going on in the US workforce generally, our benefits are still bar none in public sector. We do have more stability. I know there's been a little noise at the federal level, but we do have more stability generally, and our benefits are generally good. Long-term stability is a very big deal for people, especially when they see things that are going around outside that may make them feel a little bit more volatile or vulnerable. Now, the one thing we do want to point out with this data, that interest, so the applications alone, so that yellow line that you see is not the same thing as equitable opportunity. So while we can see those applications are strong in underrepresented areas, we tend to see a little bit of shift as we go on. Although we're seeing this representation, we are tending to see a drop-off when it comes to the referred to hire. So what we can see is the applications are strong, but the barriers at the later hiring stage tend to drop off. For example, when we look, let's go back to our slide for a second. I want to hit a couple more points. So when it's hard to see this data with going back and forth from the slides. So when we were previously at the application stage, we saw a decent percentage of Black applications coming in. Then when we go to the qualified stage, so this means how many people do we look at the paper and say they are qualified for this job? That was at 26% for Black individuals. Now, so look at that black line in particular. Now we're seeing when they go to the referred, we go down to 11%. I think it was, so from 26 to 11%, that's a large gap. What's going on there? How do we measure our hiring so we see what's going on in those hiring phases? So this does not mean that people are necessarily entering the environment less qualified, but for some reason they're not reaching that hiring stage and they're still facing barriers. Next slide, we're going to look at representation by job category. So you can see here, it's a little, you might be leaning up closer to your screen so you can get a look at this, but as Julianne said, we're going to send this out. But this heat map shows the standard occupational categorizations used by the US government to classify and organize all jobs in our labor market. So that's the infrastructure for this slide. So you can see that how race and ethnicity are represented throughout these job categories. You can see points where there's really strong or stronger representation and places where there are less strong representation. It's a really interesting visual for me because it gives us a nice picture of where are we sort of succeeding in converting employees into these job classifications in the public sector, and maybe where are we falling off. There's a lot of things we could talk about to diagnose this issue. We could go all the way down to universal child care, pre-K, to education, to access to education. But at the end of the day, this is the result of whatever's going on, one, society-wise, or two, in our hiring process. This is what we're seeing in terms of representation in minority roles and Caucasians. All right, we mentioned earlier that Hispanic and Latino representation is on the rise. We see it on the rise in some occupations rather than others. I'm curious if this is, if you collect this sort of data, if this is representative of what's going on in your environment as well. So we're seeing a rise, but we're seeing it in particular areas. So when we look at healthcare support, we're seeing a rise. When we look at installation and maintenance, we're seeing a rise. However, there are some places where we're seeing the leadership, the representation of Hispanics not being quite on. So we're seeing progress, but it's really not transferring to equitable progress across all of those job applications. Let's break down why we're showing you this slide and why it matters. So while we're seeing healthcare support, installation and maintenance, food preparation and service, administrative support go up, we're seeing underrepresentation in technical fields such as computer, math, engineering, leadership and management roles, STEM fields with degrees or certification requirements, policy, planning, and analytical classifications. And again, we're going to show this in a little bit, but those higher paying professional occupations. So the pattern says that this may be kind of a hot spot for us to address generally as public sector employers. All right, another view of the data. So as you can see on the slide, as salary levels rise, representation gaps widen, right? So as HR leaders, this slide probably captures one of the most persistent and consequential issues of workforce equity challenges. It emerges across multiple job families, so it's not necessarily saying this job family or this job family, although there are probably some stronger concentrations, but it's across job families, and it tells us a lot about how pay and how compensation is distributed across our public sector environment. So let's break down what this slide is showing us and why it matters. We can see that diversity is strong at entry level and mid-range salaries, but it declines more at the higher salary ranges. And the data shown here specifically looking within the community and social services jobs. So we're looking at just a sector of the overall jobs we've been saying in the community and social services field. We can see that Black representation drops from 42% in lower salary roles to just 19% in roles paying above 100K. Hispanic representation shows improvement in some brackets, but still declines in many high salary categories all across job families. White and Asian representation increases steadily as pay levels rise. So these gaps may reflect educational opportunities coming in, but it also may reflect outcomes from promotions. Again, we're not diagnosing your issue. We just want to give you an idea of the things that you could potentially be looking at and what's going on out in your environment. One of the most important insights from the slide is that salary-related representation can not only point to the societal issues, but also who's getting promoted, who gains access to stretch assignments. That's a very big deal. who receives mentorship and sponsorship, who accumulates specialized experience needed for higher level roles because they've been mentored, because they had access to programs or stretch assignments to prove themselves, who remains in the organization long enough to advance. So does everybody feel welcome? Do they feel comfortable? Can they put their shoulders down and relax and learn and do their job and feel like they have that ability to learn, trial, error, stretch assignments, and improve themselves and get to those higher level positions? Higher level salary roles, as we all know, often require supervisory experience, advanced degrees or certifications, tenure in some cases, definitely, you know, internal exposure and networking and access to peers that are at a higher level, high scoring interviews and panel endorsements. So if underrepresented populations don't have access to that, it certainly is not the only reason we're seeing this, but could be a large factor as to why we're seeing this disparity. Again, this is just the community and social service area because it was demonstrative and also one that's well populated in underrepresented communities. So even that in these well populated areas, we're still seeing that imbalance. Now I'm going to hand it over to Julianne for another quick poll.
Hey everyone, okay. Our next question is, when was the last time your agency reviewed hiring funnel data by a demographic group? So when was the last time you dug into the data? And some of you may not have gotten there yet. Some of you are going to be more advanced. And hopefully you get a sense for the group that this year, that's great, that people are taking a look at that data and they're starting to dive in. And there's also a lot of you that are maybe, again, at the beginning of this journey about where to focus your efforts and where to go from here. So at this point,
one of the, Julianne, I was going to pop in there and just bring a little bit of my experience in Pennsylvania to light. So one thing was, you know, we were huge and we've been tracking sort of this large rolled up data for years because we are obligated to post it. You know, so we knew how many people were in certain job classifications, you know, we knew how many people were in union jobs, and we also knew that by race, age, and that sort of thing. But what I found is that really large data did not help us identify and diagnose problems. So that's why it was so helpful for us when we were in the Commonwealth. We parsed out our hiring data. So we actually hit it a few more places than Julianne described. Instead of just applicants and referred, we hit a few more spots because we also wanted to track at the same time when we had those handoffs, you know, between candidates that we were referring, how long were they with our hiring managers? And so we wanted to know those timeframes as well. So we were able to, maybe I get called in the governor's office and say, why do we not have enough people that we can convert into X, Y, or Z job? And I remember one example so clearly, and I think I'm repeating this for those of you who are in the Ignite session, but we had this very strong focus on trying to get diverse populations into our parks, right? And we were really successful with our summer programs. We were really successful with internships in this regard, so a lot of attraction. But then when it came to actually converting people into those park ranger jobs or even just the entry park jobs, we could not get the kind of representation we were looking for. So what did we do? We grabbed that data that we've been working with NEOGOV to track, and we looked, okay, so how many applicants are coming in the door? Oh, look, we have over 1,000 people. This is not an attraction problem. And then we went to the next stage. Right in that next very stage, when we went to qualified, we hit the steepest cliff, right? So then that is what sparked us to have a conversation with the hiring manager over this area and look at the requirements. There was a very specific science degree that was being required for these jobs. And probably 95% of the applications were being knocked out because of this. So we had the same organization saying absolutely different things. We want these populations, we have to have the X, Y, and Z science degree. So how do we address that? You know, we're in a civil service environment. It's a lot trickier, but there are absolutely ways to do it. How do we identify what those skills are? Do we think somebody has those skills and abilities? How do we give them the technical training that goes along with it? Do they have an education gap that we can fill in as a part of the maybe doing some sort of apprenticeship program, not to use that in the more formal sense the federal government does, that would allow them to get educated up to the level which would be acceptable for the job. I think the main message here is we have to be creative, or else we're going to be in those spots where we're seeing a 95% dropout. So what can we do with the workforce that is saying, hey, I'm interested in this, and then we turn them away at the door? And that was just an example that I used. Never would have been able to diagnose that issue or even have a productive conversation with that one particular hiring manager who felt very strongly about this unless we saw that data. So Jillian, go right ahead.
Yeah, no, great story. Love bringing in that real world experience in those stories. So hopefully this is getting you thinking about what's happening with your data. So the next thing we wanted to kind of talk about is, we know there's a lot of conversation right now about diversity, DEI, and sometimes that conversation hits diversity and merit as being mutually exclusive. And obviously you guys are HR professionals and you know that those actually work really closely together. And so we just wanted to go over some of those common myths and point to some peer-reviewed studies that actually back it up, as whether that's informative for you or gives you some data to go start discussions with other people in your organization. So myth number one is that diversity undermines merit. As HR leaders in government, one of the most common misconceptions that you probably hear is that diversity somehow weakens meritocracy, and when an agency is focused on improving diversity, they may see that as lowering standards or hiring less qualified candidates. But again, peer-reviewed research actually shows the exact opposite. When you have structured processes and evidence-based interviewing and focused on competency alignment as far as what you actually require for the job, and then also pairing that with bias mitigation safeguards, that can help ensure that the qualifications are driving the hiring decisions and that you can get that diversity in your workforce, but also that doesn't come at the expense of meritocracy. Those things are complementary together, and that'll lead to better outcomes for all candidates, not just the underrepresented groups, that of course we are wanting to improve those outcomes as well. So the next myth is that diversity threatens meritocracy. So it's kind of similar to the first, but it shifts the framing. It suggests that initiatives that are working on diversity replace merit with quotas or identity-based preferences. And again, you guys are probably already know this, but diversity is not about quotas. It's about removing inequitable barriers and making sure that you're taking a very fair data and objective-based hiring process. So when you have job-related selection criteria, removing those unnecessary barriers, that provides equal opportunity for all the applicants, which is what we all want to get to. And again, you'll get these slides. We have the links to this data, the research that proves this out. Okay, and the third myth is that diversity lowers performance. And this is one of the most persistent, and it's also one that we can absolutely disprove. And that is that diverse teams perform worse, or that the diversity initiatives harm productivity. And obviously, again, you guys are probably already know this as well, but the evidence actually shows the reverse, that diversity is strongly associated with improving performance. It creates more innovation with that broad, bringing in multiple perspectives, and that actually results in positive financial outcomes. So when you really get down to it, diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams. We cite a couple of studies here that are actually from the private sector, but we think that that can absolutely translate to government as well, and leads to, again, better representation of the community that you represent, bringing in those perspectives, creates stronger decision-making processes, and that creates ultimately more innovation and is going to result in everyone doing better together. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Reed to kind of recap our 5 insights and talk about where to go from here.
Thanks, Julianne. So we touched at these at the top, but again, public sector continues to attract a more diverse applicant pool. So I think it's incumbent upon us to look at those applications. So what's happening in your certain job classifications? What do your pools look like when they're coming in? You know, are we taking the care and handling to look at that and see if that application representation is crossing over to those who we are deeming qualified, those who we're referring over and ultimately get hired? I mean, right? Because that's at the end of the day, that's the goal, like to put the person in the seat. So we have a really, generally overall, we have a really good framework to start with. Are we removing any of those barriers that may hit us as we go along that applicant funnel, especially with Black and Hispano Latino candidates? We also know that equity gaps exist at higher salary levels. So we saw before that candidates, you know, are coming in, but they may not be applying for the higher level jobs. So what is that? They may not be getting promoted into the higher level jobs. I know some of you may have the sense that, well, we can't necessarily take away certain qualifications, right? Like we can't take away that engineering degree, you know, so we understand that in cases there are barriers to those things. So the idea for this is to look at your heat map. How do you create your heat map and look at those places where you have underrepresentation and decide if that's a place where you can spend your time. Maybe you're not just looking at your applicant data, but you're going back and looking at your data about who was promoted into those areas. Maybe there's a certain area that has a great track record of promoting diverse candidates, and you can just see it reflected in their leadership. Were they in special programs? Did they have a special concentration on mentorship? Did they have a special concentration on stretch assignments? Were they generally more exposed to their leaders, and people made a very intentional effort to expose them to leaders that they could potentially identify with? You know, and I found that cross lines, you know, even going beyond race. I felt like when I had younger leaders talking to some of my younger population, it was more of a hit. They felt like they were living the same lives, because we all know what it can look like to be earlier in your career and what you're concerned about and what you're looking for from your work environment as opposed to later in your career. So that's one thing we can do. Where is it working and how do we look at those ideas? We also know that Black and Hispanic representation still varies significantly by occupation. So that could mean that maybe we look at our requirements and they're actually not limiting in terms of things that may be a societal factor, like degrees or what have you, but for some reason we're just not getting that representation of candidates. Are there things that we could be doing in particular for that job to increase the representation? Are we not recruiting as well in spaces and places? Go to where the people are, fish in the deep waters. So are we just not doing a good job with our recruiting? And that doesn't mean we need to build a 20-person recruitment team and go out there and blanket the world. Maybe we want to pick that one problem, with those 2 problems where we see some representation issues, and do a little bit of trial and error. Would it help if we had internships, especially with certain schools? Would it help if we did more online forums for candidates? Are we in the right spaces and places on social media where people hang out? So are we going to where they are to say, hey, we have jobs here, we think you'd be great at them, our doors are open? So I think that's something that we as HR practitioners can look at. Certainly felt that way in my public sector experience, and I still continue to feel that way in my private sector experience as the head of HR here for NEOGOV. We also know that leadership and technical roles still remain the least diverse. I have to say, from my perspective, I have a lot of hope for this because organically I'm seeing more change. We were really focused on, in the Commonwealth, on internship programs. You know, we did some partnering with our governor's office where they got really bought into bringing people in and having them maybe do 1 or 2 year stints in policy jobs and other jobs where there was less representation. So kind of creating, we called them William Penn Fellows. It kind of created a little bit of excitement around them. We tried to get them from different areas of the state. It could be from different areas of the county or different areas in terms of your agencies, but it takes intention to do that, right? And what I saw with those programs, whether it was our internship program, we even did one with HR where we were intentionally recruiting kind of a cohort and bringing them in together, that I organically saw more diversity of representation, and that was so refreshing to see. That doesn't mean that, you know, we get to wait for the diversity to come to us. There are things we should do, and maybe it could just be creating a very intentional program. I'll tell you one thing that I specifically found really helpful, because I know we as HR practitioners worry about refreshing our HR ranks. Hiring in classes and cohorts, especially like in a bigger environment, you know, and maybe that cohort for you looks like 3, maybe it looks like 20 if you're in a bigger environment, like in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania where we had 900 HR employees and we were centralized. But people love to come and be able to go through that learning experience with other people, right? So you may not be taking 100% of those folks through the end of their career, but you don't need to. You get 1 or 2 really well bought in people. That makes a huge difference in your organization. So think about when you're looking for that younger population, being really intentional about programs where they feel like they can learn and they can contribute, but they also feel like they have colleagues to do it alongside with, and be intentional about your recruiting. What, you know, where do you go for those candidates and what does that look like? I felt like that was a really impactful thing for the Commonwealth, and happy to share any information about how we did that, as I'm sure my old colleagues at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania are. So generally what we're saying is this data really underscores the need to be continually looking at this and have continual improvement. What you can do in your environment is really based on your data. What does it look like? You probably instinctually know that one just stinks, I need some help there. Go and find that data to validate what you're seeing, because that's going to help you make the case to, if it's your budget person, if it's the head of your city, if it's, you know, whoever you report into, to help you create these programs and do these intentional things. You're going to need data to back that up. Anecdotal stories just aren't enough, and this data is really going to help you support the things that you're trying to do to move that needle. All right, so I jumped the gun a little bit because the next slide says, what can you do? So let me go back over some other things that you can do in addition to the things that I just talked about. Evaluating your minimum qualifications and focusing on skill-based hiring. There's been a lot of talk about skills-based hiring. Some of you who are deeply steeped in merit hiring, you may say, yeah, and we've been doing that since our civil service law was passed in 1964 or whatever it was. Keep focusing on that. It makes a really big deal to be looking for what are those specific things that we need for the job. How do we take away the things that are just noise and not really impactful for the environment? So looking through that JD and peeling things away. It may be that at some point you add it back in if it's not working, but be open to making those changes and looking at those minimum qualifications and looking at who you're hiring, because I know that we're competing for employees in different worlds maybe than 20 years ago public sector used to be. You know, we are seeing increases in salaries from you know, the McDonald's, the Walmarts, any of those other places. They are definitely, you know, eating into our employment pools for sure, and competing with us in ways maybe they didn't used to compete with us. Also, it may be that people aren't as focused on their retirement, aren't as focused as mission as they used to be, but those folks are still out there. They definitely are. So, you know, keep raising those things up. But looking at the skills, you know, you're going to have a better chance of not sidelining, like the slide says, otherwise highly capable candidates. Auditing the recruitment process. Look at this by your stages. Your aggregate data is not going to tell you a lot. What's happening by job, by stage. And then adopting the intentional process to reduce bias. I know this can be hard because maybe sometimes you feel like you don't have a lot of diversity in your own ranks, and so you're tapping the same person over and over again to sort of like do this, sit on these panels, you know, but just do what you can. It will get better because the more diversity that you hire, the less bias you're going to have naturally in the environment. So just remember that nobody has to be perfect at this, but we do need to be intentional about it because we know we have better work environments when we focus on these things. So right now I'm gonna hand it back to Julianne to wrap it up.
Okay, well, I wanted to point out a couple things before we jump to questions. And when you get the copy of the 2025 diversity report, if you turn to page 19, we actually have a checklist that you can go down to start to, it's really just asking a bunch of questions like, are your job postings reaching a diverse variety of candidates? It's thought starters to help you start to figure out where to focus your energy. And that's a great place to start. Go through it yourself, get a team together and go through it together, collaborate on it. And again, looking, as Reed said, at the specific stages in the funnel can give you an idea of where to focus your efforts, because it can feel super overwhelming to say, oh, we need to do this big thing like bring diversity into our agency. But it feels a little bit more actionable when you have specific things and specific areas that you can focus on. So we want to kind of end up where we started, which is what's the story, what story does your data tell you about your hiring process? We wanted to kind of change that for as you look forward and decide what are the goals that you're going to set for yourself based on your own situation, based on what you know about your hiring pool and your process. What story do you want your data to tell? And that can be what do you want it to look like in a year? What do you want it to look like in 2 years, 5 years? And that can hopefully generate discussion among your team to figure out where you want to go and what is something that is a reasonable goal for what where you're at with your agency. Again, some of you are already further along the path than this, and some of you are just starting. We've mentioned this a couple of times, but I just want to reiterate that it's in digging through the data and taking a super close look at the specific stages in your hiring process that you can identify where the problem areas are and work to improve that. And a couple of examples are, you know, again, you guys probably already know this, but you know, at the attraction stage, maybe it's you need to have different language in the job description to attract a different customer. You know, is your issue at the qualified stage, then you need to look at minimum requirements, or is it in your hiring process? And so that requires you to do some training with the people who are going to be interviewing so that they can approach this with a more objective and unbiased perspective as they and hopefully that results in bringing in more of the candidates and actually hiring more of the candidates that that you want. So as I've mentioned a couple times, the full report is out now, but we will include that with the slides and this recording. We just picked a few things that are in the to cover in the webinar today. There's a lot more insights in there, and so hopefully that gives you a wide range of things to benchmark yourself against what's happening nationally and evaluate whether you need to change something to be more like it looks nationally, or you know that there's a reason that you're different and you want to lean into that and continue to focus on the areas that you've set goals against. And so now we'll jump to questions. Go ahead and write any questions in the chat while that's coming in. Reed, why don't you talk from your experience as more people are putting questions in the chat. Are there some specific strategies that you've seen that work really well for attracting and retaining diverse talent? You talked about a few of those things, but anything else that you would like to bring up or experiences that you feel like would be helpful for them as they start to ideate around how to bring in a different group or new applicants?
Yeah, I mean, I think I already hit on some of them: mentorship programs, internship programs, leadership programs, those things. When you're so busy as HR practitioners, they feel like nice to haves as opposed to must haves. And then you turn around and you're like, well, who's our heir apparent? Gosh, I don't have anyone that I would choose within my ranks to do these things, because we missed that. We missed that development stage. I think that we have the ability to look at people within our stable as well. So we've talked a lot about the applicants and who we're attracting, but like, do we know who our employees are? Do we know what their hidden skills are? You're maybe just meeting X, Y, and Z who's doing this particular job, but maybe in a prior life, in a prior career, they have experience in other places. So how are we sort of using our ability to have data to tell us the story of our employees? So how do we kind of create opportunities from within? And I know sometimes we get so caught up in our structures, right? So, I'm totally making this up, but maybe we need more people to move into this procurement area. But when you see some people over here that would be really well suited for it, but they'd have to go down in the pay scale to do that. Sometimes we kind of trip over ourselves, in order to do this. How do we take those barriers away so that people can feel like they can go fill a need that we definitively have, and not have to disadvantage themselves as an employee just because their path went a little bit differently? So I think those conversations about internal movement are really, really important, and just let common sense guide. Sometimes we can't be at the mercy of certain things, like our pay scales, and we have huge gaps here. I'm not saying pay more, but maybe there's some sort of program that people would really feel lucky to get chosen into to do X, Y, or Z job, where they are, where you are lacking employees. So look at your internal pool. Like, we're not going to, do you like what you're doing but don't love it? We're not going to disadvantage you if you want to take advantage of this new opportunity. And what do you have to do to train to get them there? So I think looking at internal mobility and having the time to focus on that, is probably a challenge, but a good challenge to meet.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that your experience and sharing a couple examples. So one of the questions that came in through the chat is around applicant representation. I think you were talking about maybe the first insight in that first graph. The question is it the same category in the job spec, or is the data just overall interest in government jobs versus US? So the way we organize the data for that initial insight number one and some of the the graphs that we created from that data to help visualize what's happening. That was looking at our public sector data, which comes out of our insight product, versus the general population, US population versus census data. So at that level, we didn't dig down to the specific job categories. When later in the presentation we talk about specific job categories, that is just measuring against the data that was within our system. So getting past that first level, we're not comparing to broader US population. We're just looking at the data of public sector applications and how that looks versus some of the other job categories and versus maybe some other demographics. So hopefully that answers.
I think the important thing to remember is that you're going to have to choose what your best benchmark is, right? So we know that we show you all sort of what's going on, in the NEOGOV data that we have access to. So that's state data, that's, counties, that's cities, that's port authorities, the people that use our product. It's a lot of people. It's a really good representation. But you need to decide, what does that comparative factor look like for you, and what's going to be the most impactful for you when you're truly trying to solve the problem.
Yep, that's great. Okay, another question regarding wage gaps in higher level positions. What can agencies do to support interview skills, specifically for internal upward movement? When we do structured interviews, which is for equity and bias reduction, internal candidates struggle in the STAR interviews process as compared to external candidates who are more skilled in interview techniques and practice.
It's practice. It's giving them the opportunity to have mentors to practice with. At the end of the day, we want the skills that they have to come through and shine in that interview, because they are not flexing that muscle very often. Kind of just like when we started this presentation, Julianne, took us a couple slides to get the juices flowing. If you're not using that muscle, and they may also be assuming like, well, you know me, I don't have to tell you, you know, all those skills for myself because you see me every day, or it feels weird talking to you about this, you know, because I'm an internal applicant. So I think one, giving them the ability and space to say, this is a place where you can come and you can talk about yourself in a complimentary way. You are not bragging about your skills. You are not bragging about your accomplishments, and don't feel weird reminding us of those great things that you've done. So one, I think kind of like giving them that safe space to do that, and then having them be able to practice with somebody that's outside the panel, like someone who maybe it's retired employees who kind of miss the environment and they want to come back and help old coworkers and help people advance. How do you set up some of those times where they can just be in a safe space to practice? Because you're right, they're not on the hunt necessarily. They're not out there kind of like if you're job hunting, you're in the moment, you're in the time frame. So, you know, we want them to succeed in these. So do some practice with them. Dry runs are probably the best thing you can do.
Yeah, I've noticed that in some other organizations that I've been in where they, you know, have done workshops on how to interview because they're really invested in those internal candidates and keeping and retaining the talent that they know. You know, the internal candidates have skills, they're known skills. You don't have to take a chance on someone that may be less known. And so how can you help them bring that out and shine?
You know,
and
one thing that I would encourage them to do is film themselves, you know, doing that, and then critique themselves, or give them the ability to ask the questions and you're the applicant and you're answering, and have them give you feedback, right? Because that's going to put them in a position where, you know, they're feeling like a little bit like it's not just all about me, like, oh, their mind's going to be opened in different ways if they're thinking, well, how would I critique that? So one, have them film themselves and then have them sit down, you know, on their own and do an assessment and maybe discuss that together. And the other thing is definitely do the role reversal, because that's going to trigger thoughts for them.
That's great. Okay, hopefully that answered the question. That is all the questions. I think there's a couple more that said, will we get the slides for future reference? And yes, we will send the slides, we'll send out the full diversity report, and you'll get the recording. So if you want to rewatch some sections of this, or you want to share some parts of this with your colleagues, you know, we encourage you to share the content that you found very relevant, share the diversity report, and again, use that as a kickoff point with your organization to help get those conversations started, get people thinking, and bring everybody into that process. Because so much of making changes is getting that buy-in, and when people are part of the process, many times that helps overcome maybe any concerns or friction that might be there. They feel like they're helping to improve that process and make it better. Reed, is there anything else that you want to cover or mention before we wrap up?
Yeah, so just two things. One is find your champion. You know, there could be someone who maybe is a non-traditional partner for you. Maybe it's across another agency. Maybe it's in a different area of your own agency that says like, I'm really interested in creating this X, Y, or Z, this mentorship program, this stretch project committee. Like, do you want to partner with me? Go find your people who want to stand side by side with you and have the same feelings about wanting to either upskill your workforce so you can be promoting more from within, or creating things like internship programs that may not exist. So find your partner to partner up with them. Two, start small. You guys have a really big job. Working in government HR was one of the harder things that I ever did. And I remember when I was kind of sort of in the midst of it, I was at a big conference with a bunch of other HR leaders. I remember this so clearly. And there was a woman who had been over agencies. This is actually out of Idaho, had been over agencies, and they had like a change in their HR person. So they asked her, the governor asked her to come in and run HR. And she said, this is harder than any other cabinet job that I've had. You know, it's just harder. It is hard, right? It may not have the complexity that Safe Water or whatever it does, but it is very difficult. So give yourselves a break. let yourself do some exploring on empathy burnout as HR practitioners. That's something that we can really run into. It's just, you're dealing so every day with issues that it feels like, you just get some empathy burnout. So from HR practitioner to HR practitioner, I encourage you to do that and give yourself a little room to recognize that it does get, tiring doing this all the time, but start small. Get a partner, start small, and enjoy it. And you're going to have reward in addition to whatever you're going to bring back to your agency or department.
Yeah, I love that. And just to build on that, making a couple of small goals and focusing on making those improvements in those areas. Again, you'll be able to see the impact so much more, and it will feel like less of an overwhelming process, which, we're committed to helping you do your job better and making your job easier. And so hopefully the insights that you got from this webinar have given you some things to think about and discuss with your team. And if there's any other questions, again, we're going to send out the slides and everything. Feel free to reach out, but we are so grateful that you joined us today, and hopefully we'll see you for another webinar in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.